Chinese barbecue pork, Char Siu, is maybe the easiest dish in the world to screw up even if you follow a recipe perfectly. You buy all the right ingredients, marinate the pork overnight, and your kitchen smells incredible while it's cooking. But when you slice into it, it's dry, like genuinely hard to chew. If that's ever happened, it was not your fault. You could get the exact marinade recipe from the best barbecue shop in Hong Kong, follow it to a T, and your Char Siu would still come out dry. Because there's a specific way this cut of pork needs to be cooked, and I've seen very few recipes online even mention it. So today I'll show you how to make tender, juicy Char Siu every single time using nothing but a standard home oven. If you look at almost any Char Siu recipe, the thing people spend the most time on is the marinade. And for the longest time, so did I. It's got all these ingredients most of us have never cooked with, so I assumed that's what separated the real thing from what I was making at home. But then I went through 10 Char Siu recipes from 9 different cookbooks, including the most respected Cantonese authors in print, and actually compared the marinades, expecting every author to have their own version. And I found they're basically all the same. Hoisin, soy sauce, oyster sauce, sugar, 5-spice, some kind of Chinese cooking wine, and fermented bean curd. That's the basic marinade. If your recipe came out of an actual cookbook, or honestly even most blogs, that's pretty much the same thing the best shops in Hong Kong are using. Which brings us back to what I said at the start. What separates the best Char Siu in the world from the dry stuff we're making at home is how the meat gets cooked. But before we get into that, the pork still has to marinate overnight, so let me show you the ingredients that go into the marinade and where to find them. Out of everything that goes into this, there are really only 4 ingredients you might not be familiar with. The rest of it is regular grocery store stuff. The first one is also the most important: red fermented bean curd, or nam yu. This is where Char Siu gets that savory flavor you can taste but can't quite put your finger on. It's the thing that makes restaurant Char Siu taste like the restaurants. You'll typically find it in the preserved foods section of an Asian grocery store. Now, when you're standing in front of that shelf, you're going to see 2 kinds of jars that both say red bean curd on the label. One gets its color from red yeast, and that's the one you want. The other gets it from chili, and that one will make your pork spicy. If you're not sure which one you're holding, just check the ingredients for red yeast rice. And red yeast rice is actually your next ingredient, because this is what was traditionally used to give Char Siu that dark red color. It's just rice that's been fermented with a red yeast, and it doesn't really add any flavor. It's there to dye the meat naturally. You'll notice a lot of takeout Char Siu has a sort of fake neon red hue to it. That doesn't come from this stuff. That comes from food dye, which restaurants use to mimic the natural color of red yeast rice. You'll usually find this with the rice at the Asian market, even though we're using it more as a spice. If you can't find it, a couple drops of red food dye gets you the standard takeout color. Either way, it's purely cosmetic, so this one is really more about how you want it to look. The third one is Chinese rose wine. And before you have flashbacks of your favorite wine aunt, this is not rosé, which is a completely different thing. This is a clear cooking wine that's been sweetened with sugar and infused with rose petals. It's the traditional spirit that's used to add a slight floral note to Char Siu. The English spellings are all over the place. Mine says Mai K Lo, but you also might see Mai Q Lo or something close to it. So if you're not sure, just check the label for rose in the ingredients. You'll usually find it right next to the other cooking wines like Shaoxing or Miqiu. If you can't track it down, Shaoxing works fine as a substitute. That's what most recipes call for anyway. The last one is the only ingredient that isn't in the marinade: maltose. It's a thick, sticky malt sugar you'll find near the honey or the syrups. It's also a lot less sweet than regular sugar, and it's what Chinese barbecue shops use to glaze their Char Siu and give it that shiny coating. It's usually only a few dollars, but if you can't find it, you can use honey as a 1-to-1 substitute by weight. That covers the 4 unfamiliar ingredients. The rest of the marinade is stuff you can find anywhere, so now we can make it. We'll start by mashing up 2 to 4 cubes of the fermented bean curd with 1 teaspoon of the brine from the jar in a small bowl. This is what gives Char Siu that really savory flavor I told you about, the one that's hard to put your finger on. You'll smell a bit of the funk as it starts breaking down. To that paste, you'll add 3 tablespoons of hoisin and 2 tablespoons of light soy sauce, plus a single teaspoon of dark soy sauce, which is mostly there for color. Then 1 tablespoon of oyster sauce, 2 tablespoons of brown sugar, and a tablespoon and a half of the rose wine we talked about earlier. Next, add 1 teaspoon of Chinese 5-spice, 3 cloves of grated garlic, a 1/4 teaspoon of white pepper, and a teaspoon of toasted sesame oil. You can also add a 1/4 teaspoon of MSG, which a lot of restaurants use, and I'm not going to pretend like they don't. Last, sprinkle in 1/4 to 1/2 teaspoon of red yeast rice powder. Before you add it, you'll want to grind it down first because it comes as little grains of rice, not a powder. You should be able to do this in a few seconds in a mortar and pestle. How much you end up adding is really just how red you want it. Then whisk everything together until the marinade is smooth and the bean curd and spices are well incorporated. You can keep this in a covered container in the fridge for about a week if you want to make it ahead of time. With the marinade made, the only thing left is the pork itself. The cut you choose here is very important because if you get the wrong one and it comes out dry, there's really no fixing it after that. The cut you want is boneless pork butt, which despite the Sir Mix-a-Lot name, comes from the shoulder. So you might also see it labeled as pork shoulder. Look for a well-marbled piece that is close to half fat and half lean, with streaks of fat running all the way through it. That extra fat is essential for this dish. Over a long cook, it renders down and bastes the meat from the inside, and it's what keeps your char siu juicy. What you want to stay away from is a lean cut like loin or tenderloin. There's just not enough fat running through them to keep them juicy the whole way through, so they often end up dry. Once you've got your piece, the first thing to do is find the grain of the meat. You can see it in the way the muscle fibers all run in the same direction. You want to cut with the grain into slices about 1.25 inches to 1.5 inches thick. The shape really doesn't matter, but try to keep the thickness even so they all finish cooking around the same time. Later, once it's cooked, we'll slice the other way across the grain, and that's what makes each piece tender. With the strips cut, the pork is ready to marinate. But before it does, take about 2 tablespoons of the marinade and set it aside, because that's what we'll combine with the maltose to glaze it at the very end. Pour the rest over the pork and toss them around so every piece is evenly coated and put them in a covered dish or a Ziploc bag. Once they're in the fridge, you really only need to marinate the pork for anywhere from about 8 to 24 hours. Marinades only penetrate about 1/8 of an inch into the meat, so they're really just seasoning the surface. Going for longer doesn't get the flavor any deeper, and it can make the meat tougher. While that pork marinates, let's talk about the real reason your char siu comes out dry. The cut we're using, pork shoulder, is one of the most used muscles on the pig, and that's exactly what makes it tricky. All the work it does means the meat is full of collagen, the connective tissue that makes a cut tough. The only way to turn that collagen tender is to convert it to gelatin, and that conversion takes many hours of low, steady heat. The traditional way to make char siu is over an open flame, like a rotisserie. A lot of people try to mimic this at home with a really fast, high-heat cook in their oven, but that doesn't give the collagen any time to convert to gelatin. So at home, you want to do the opposite and cook it low and slow like a barbecue, long enough to break that collagen down. Generally, I like to cook mine at 225 for anywhere from 2 to 5 hours. Now, real quick before we cook this thing, Typhur is paying me to talk about their Sync Oven, and I'll tell you why it actually earns a spot with this dish. That time range I just gave you, 2 to 5 hours, that's a huge window because you're not really cooking this by the clock. You're cooking it to one number, the temperature in the dead center of that pork. A normal oven only lets you control the heat and the time, but it tells you nothing about what's going on in the middle of the meat. You end up cracking the door, dropping your temperature 50 degrees, and stabbing in a thermometer that only reads one spot. Typhur Sync Oven fixes this with a wireless thermometer that's built right into the oven. You just set the internal temperature you want, push the probe into the thickest part, and it shuts off the second it gets there. 5 sensors run down that probe, accurate to half a degree, and it's NIST verified. So even on a big, awkward cut like ours, it reads the true center, not wherever the tip happened to land. And the app shows the temperature climbing the whole time, right on your phone, so you don't have to babysit it for 5 hours. Typhur Sync Oven is at its lowest price of the year right now, and you can use the code FARMER10 on their website for extra savings, or check the links in the description for the best deal. Alright, back to the pork. Once it's done marinating, take it out of the fridge about an hour before you're ready to cook it. This will temper the meat and help it cook more evenly. Preheat your oven to 225 degrees and lay the strips flat on a foil-lined sheet pan with a little room between them. Slide the temperature probe directly into the middle of the thickest strip so it's reading the center the entire time. That internal number is the only thing we actually care about here. Then lightly cover the pan with another sheet of foil. Put the pan in the oven and you'll notice the temperature start to climb. When it hits the 150s, it'll slow way down. It'll sit there barely moving for what feels like way too long. In barbecue, this is called the stall, and it's the most important part of the process. Remember that collagen we talked about earlier? This slow stretch is when it finally converts into gelatin. So whatever you do, do not turn up the oven to make it go faster. That slow conversion is what turns a tough cut into a tender one. If you rush it, you'll end up with the dry, tough pork we've been trying to avoid this whole time. Once it goes past the stall, you'll want to take it all the way up to 180 degrees in the center. The entire process usually takes somewhere between 2 and 5 hours, depending on the size of your strips and how fatty they are. But you always go by the temperature and not the clock. While the pork is in the oven, let me show you how to make the glaze so it's ready to go as soon as we hit our temperature. It's just 2 things: 3 tablespoons of maltose and the 2 tablespoons of marinade we set aside earlier. If you've never worked with maltose, it is the single stickiest substance on the planet, and it's basically impossible to work with. A good trick I picked up from Chef Steps is to wet your hands first. For whatever reason, that keeps it from sticking to you. The easiest way to make the glaze is to drop the maltose and the reserved marinade into a bowl together and microwave them for about 30 seconds. That softens the maltose enough to whisk them into a glaze that's smooth and easy to brush on. Then just set it aside until the pork is ready. When the middle hits 180, the cooking part is basically done, and now we turn these strips into actual Char Siu. So take the pork out, pull off the top foil, and put the strips onto a plate so you can pour out all the liquid sitting at the bottom of the pan. Don't get rid of it. I'll tell you what barbecue shops do with this liquid in a bit. Lay a clean sheet of foil on the pan and crank the oven up to 350 degrees. While that heats, dry each strip off as well as you can. You want these really dry because the glaze won't set well on a wet surface. Once they're all dry, place the pork back on the baking sheet and brush them all over with the glaze we set aside. Once you're up to temp, slide them into the preheated oven for about 3 minutes to let that first coat set. And you're not really cooking it more here, you're just setting the glaze. Then pull them out and brush on one more coat of the glaze and put it back in the oven for an additional 3 minutes. It's this coating of the maltose and the marinade that gives it that glossy, lacquered shine. At this point, you're basically done, but if you want those blackened edges like you see at traditional barbecue shops, you can turn your broiler on high and stick it back in the oven until it looks like you want it to. Just don't walk away because the sugar goes from caramelized to straight up burnt in a matter of seconds. This is the only step where doom scrolling is genuinely a high-stakes decision. When it looks good to you, pull the pork out and let it rest for several minutes before slicing into it. This will let the juices redistribute so they stay in the meat when you cut it instead of ending up all over your cutting board. Take your strips and turn them perpendicular from how you cut them before. So now you're slicing across the grain. Remember we cut the meat with the grain to section them before? Now slicing the meat the other way is what makes the slices tender instead of chewy. All that juiciness and tenderness comes from how we cooked it. Because we cooked this tough piece of pork low and slow, it gave all that tough connective tissue the time it needed to break down instead of blasting it with heat and leaving it tough and dry the way most recipes do. Now, real quick before the taste test, remember those juices we poured off earlier? A lot of Chinese barbecue shops will save that liquid and use it as a sauce over their rice bowls. They call it Char Siu sauce. All you'll do is strain it into a small saucepan and reduce it down a little to concentrate the flavor. Then you can spoon it over the sliced pork or over rice, whatever you want. It's really flavorful, so I always save it to use as a sauce. All right, back to the taste test. Char Siu is one of the great dishes of the world, so it's a shame how hard it is to make well at home. But after testing this dozens of times, cooking it low and slow, almost like a pulled pork or an American barbecue, really does make a huge difference and keeps it juicy and tender every time. If you've got any leftover Char Siu after making this, it's really good inside of an egg roll. The trick is getting them super crispy without being greasy, and I've got a video that will show you how to do that right here. Thanks for watching. See you next time.